Thanks to EA for sponsoring this video. Whether it's cutting through Darkspawn on the front lines, using your quickness to maneuver around the battlefield, or channeling the elements for a magical attack, Dragon Age the Veilguard gives you the power to forge your own destiny. My name is Kodiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and today we're breaking down the Warrior, Rogue, and Mage to help you determine which is the best class for your playstyle. Before ever stepping foot into the world of Dragon Age, you'll be confronted with a choice. Which class do you want to play? Don't approach this decision lightly, as you're locked into the class you choose. The only way to play something different is to create a new save file, so your best bet is to go into that decision with as much knowledge as possible, and that's where we come in. We've been playing Dragon Age the Veilguard for 2+ weeks now, and we have 3 members playing each of the 3 different classes to give you the best insight possible. When the Darkspawn are closing in, there is no class better suited for taking them all on than the Warrior. Charging into battle with a sword and board as well as a beefy two-hander, Warriors are quite literally adept at any scenario, and with a slew of unique and dynamic active skills, they can cut practically any enemy down to size. The bread and butter for the Warrior is the main combination of a one-handed weapon and a shield. This can either be an axe or a longsword in the main hand, and a heater or targe in the offhand. What you get is exactly what you'd expect, a faster, lower damage pairing, but with the added defenses that wearing a shield provides. In Veilguard's incredibly fluid combat system, a sword and board feels far less bulky than you might expect, and it doesn't limit you in ways that other games might. The shield adds a layer of defenses to your gameplay, allowing you to block all but the most powerful attacks, while also giving you the flexibility to parry an incoming blow. No matter which of the 2 weapon sets you have active, you always have the ability to throw your shield, which is your primary way to deal with barriers, the blue health bars that certain enemies have. There are skills that make this aspect of your kit even stronger, allowing you to lean into the ability if you like. If you're willing to shed some of your defenses, the Warrior can also switch at any time during combat to a two-hander, usually a great axe or maul. This is a much slower weapon, but also deals more outright damage and inflicts more stagger on enemies. Like the Mage class, you can swap between your weapon loadouts as often as you want during combat, which gives the class some added flexibility, and once you enhance both sets of weapons with skills from the talent tree, you'll most likely utilize both throughout the game. Unlike Warriors in most other games, Veilguard pushes the boundaries of the class fantasy, and that really becomes apparent with its active abilities. Even your first skill, Driving Kick, might be different than what you'd expect, and that trend continues as you unlock new abilities through the skill tree. Eventually, you'll be able to use skills like Fury of the Forge, which completely pushes the Warrior fantasy, allowing you to call down flaming ethereal swords that deal damage and burn enemies. However, none of this is possible without Rage, the Warrior's primary resource. As the Warrior attacks, they generate Rage, and each of the Warrior's abilities has a Rage cost. You'll notice the Rage resource bar at the bottom of the screen with small nodes along its path. Depending on the skill, it might cost 1 or 2 Rage points, and it's important to remember this because you'll want to balance which abilities you have equipped. If you only have spenders that cost 2 Rage, you're going to have a lot more downtime in your rotation. But if you mix in a few 1 Rage spenders, you'll have a lot more flexibility when fighting groups of enemies. Once you reach level 20, you can start tapping into the Warrior's 3 specializations, which all transform some of the fundamental characteristics about how the Warrior engages in combat. Champion focuses on fire damage, AoE and single target burning, buffing ally damage while also buffing your defenses. Slayer specializes in your two-handed weapon, dealing physical damage rapidly while also increasing rage buildup and armor penetration. Reaper is all about necrotic damage, using it to leech life from your enemies. Reaper also enhances your shield toss skill, making it more powerful, spread leech, apply necrotic, and heal. Veilguard's version of a Warrior is incredibly fluid, and because of how well the skill tree allows you to push the class fantasy, you have a lot more options than your traditional high fantasy game. However, at its core, you're doing what you always do as a Warrior, hacking and slashing your way through whatever obstacle is in front of you. There just so happens to be more options for how you do that best. What feels great is how quickly you can engage and disengage with enemies, landing attacks to build up rage, and then, in harmony with your companions, unleash a flurry of attacks that deal insane amounts of damage or completely eliminate a threat. Because the Warrior has access to a throwable shield, You also have options for dealing damage or disrupting enemies at a distance, and I don't want to undersell this. While not your strongest skill, it's easy to weave a shield throw into combat, making it feel like an extension of your kit, not something extra you have to remember to do. Because there are so many enemies that have blue barrier health bars, you use shield throw enough that it becomes second nature, and once upgraded with a skill or two, it's just as potent as your standard attacks. If you're okay being in the throes of the action and don't mind a flurry of steel, then the warrior might be the right class for you. When I think of the Veilguard rogue, I think of two things: speed and style. For the most part, the rogue is a melee class that rewards players to avoid taking damage and can land hits of their own, and I'd say that alone makes them more suited for RPG veterans. The learning curve is steeper, but the skill ceiling is also higher, which makes them the perfect class for players looking for a rewarding challenge. The class is unique in that they don't have two sets of melee weapons to switch between and are limited to dual wielding as their primary weapons, but they do also have access to a bow, which provides them a consistent way to deal damage from afar. As with the other classes in the game, your standard light attacks deal the most damage to red health bars, and in the case of the rogue, you can chain together 5 attacks, with the final hit dealing more damage. The bow I mentioned before excels at popping blue barrier shields, and because of the rogue's ability to close gaps quickly, it's often followed up by a melee attack. When dealing with armor, the rogue has a unique ability that allows them to uppercut and then slam down into the target, dealing increased damage to yellow health bars. This is unlike other classes in the game that rely more readily on standard heavy attacks, giving the rogue a bit more flexibility to deal with those types of enemies. As you might expect, you'll rely almost entirely on your blades, but depending on the build you're going for, your bow can become a tool you rely on as well. Yes, you're exposed, but once you unlock companions with AoE taunt capabilities, some of the enemy aggro pressure can be shifted to your allies, freeing you up for more deadly ranged attacks. In order to use most rogue abilities, you need momentum, the class resource. This can only be gained by attacking enemies cleanly. If at any point you get hit by an enemy attack, you lose most, if not all, of your momentum, most likely causing your abilities to become inactive. This can be a punishing mechanic, which is why I say the rogue is a bit more challenging for players that aren't used to a more risk versus reward system, like momentum. However, when you string together a flurry of attacks, avoiding getting hit in the process, you'll quickly gain enough charge to amplify all of your attacks and unleash your active abilities to devastating effect. While momentum is a potent resource to master, you will want to diversify your skills, having at least one that's tied just to a cooldown. This ensures you always have an option, even if you don't have momentum. Abilities like Reeling Bolt, a cooldown-based ability, also give you multiple effects to capitalize on. Weakening enemies reduces their outgoing damage and keeps you alive longer, while the AoE pull effect of the skill helps to control enemies, allowing for follow-up attacks that can hit multiple targets at once. Pilfer, another cooldown-based ability, allows you to steal a potion off an enemy when you hit them with the skill, which, if used wisely, almost will always guarantee you have a health potion at your disposal. At level 20, the rogue really begins to come online with specializations, and those all focus on a specific aspect of the rogue's kit. Duelist pushes the rogue's melee capabilities to the next level, leaning heavily into stacking adrenaline, permanently debuffing enemy defenses, and controlling enemies with necrosis and stagger while amplifying your damage. Veil Ranger turns your bow from a simple tool into a high-damage elite killer, tapping further into electricity damage, augmenting your charged shots with follow-up arrows and knockdown effects, and allowing you to instantly kill staggered enemies from a distance. Finally, you have the Saboteur, which dances between both ranged and melee combat to control enemies. Unlike the other two specializations, every active skill on this path is cooldown focused rather than momentum dependent. Here you'll embrace explosives and contraptions like a deployable turret, as well as buff you and your party by reducing skill cooldown timers and making ranged attacks multi-shot. When it comes to the rogue, you genuinely don't have much in the way of defensive options with your kit. You aren't a glass cannon like Mage, but you flirt with that line. Because of this, mastering the defend mechanic is essential, as it will not only keep you alive longer, but many skills and nodes within your skill tree grant numerous buffs when you successfully defend. Bleeding, necrosis, guaranteed critical strikes, it all comes naturally when you parry attacks, which means, for the most part, the rogue wants to be in the thick of the action, with your head on a swivel, of course. The rogue also doesn't have to worry about swapping weapons at all. You can dance fluidly between your dual swords and bow, and it allows you to engage at whatever distance is most beneficial to you at that time. That being said, the bow is more of a tool to deplete shields unless you focus on it in your skill tree path for that weapon. It's night and day how different the bow feels and performs if you aren't spec'd into it, and that's something all players should keep in the back of their head. Livid, who's playing the rogue on our team, was really not feeling the duelist playstyle, but after changing skills and committing to the Veil Ranger, everything clicked in the bow gameplay, which once felt cumbersome, began to overshadow the melee combat entirely. If you're not comfortable fighting toe-to-toe with Darkspawn, you have a ranged option, the Mage. This class uses mana to unleash a barrage of spells that span across 4 distinct schools of magic: fire, electric, necrotic, and cold. Your primary and secondary weapon also can tap into these schools of magic, so depending on your loadout and build, you have every element, quite literally, at your fingertips. But it all has to start somewhere, and in the case of the Mage, things begin and end with your weapons. The Mage has 2 options that you can seamlessly swap between during combat, but it's how those 2 weapons interact that make them truly unique. You're going to have a preference, and I personally enjoy the one-handed dagger and elemental orb that make up your primary weapon combination. It's fast and allows you to send out attack after attack in between your more powerful active abilities. The dagger and the orb combination is speedier, but deals less damage and has less range than your staff. But one interesting thing is that with each light attack, it applies an instance of Arcane Bomb. Once this builds up to 3 stacks, you can use a heavy attack and the enemy will explode for additional damage. On the flip side, your staff attacks are slower, but deal more damage and have a longer range. Your staff can also be empowered by all of your light attacks, which you can track here. As you attack, the meter builds up, and at any time, you can unleash a charged heavy staff attack to amplify the damage and size of the blast. Because heavy attacks are designed to break armored units, it's a perfect way to quickly take those enemies out of the equation. But a charged attack also deals a decent amount of standard damage to red enemy health bars. You can swap between your 2 weapon sets at any point during combat, which is similar to that of the warrior, but I personally find there to be much more alignment with both weapons on the Mage. Ultimately, it comes down to personal preference, which weapon you choose to use, as there are benefits, drawbacks, and skills you can invest in for both. What makes up the bulk of your damage dealing potential are your active abilities, and in the case of the Mage, those are spells. More so than any other class, your skills play a large part in creating your class identity, and because you can respec anytime, you can pivot to embrace any school of magic and type of attack. As I mentioned before, the Mage uses mana as their primary resource, and that's something you'll need to be mindful of when unlocking and assigning spells. Some of the more basic spells don't require the use of mana and are strictly on or off cooldown. Other, more powerful spells will require you to spend mana in order to cast them. What I'm saying shouldn't be a surprise, but you do have to be aware of this. If you end up with spells all on your hotbar that are mana dependent, then you won't feel the natural ebb and flow of the Mage's combat. But if you balance a couple cooldown spells with 1 or 2 heavy hitters, you'll really start to see the Mage in peak form. In my opinion, the Mage also benefits from 3 of the coolest specializations in the game. Not only because they're so strikingly different, but because they transform foundational aspects of the Mage's kit. The Evoker focuses on cold spells, with its 2 branching paths either enhancing your staff attacks or your dagger and orb attacks, making them more powerful in almost every scenario. The Spellblade gives you more tools for dealing with enemies up close, while also tapping into electricity spells, a potent combination if you're confident in your ability to dodge and parry. Finally, there's the Deathcaller, which, as the name alludes to, puts the power of the undead in your hands, strengthening your necrosis spells, while also substantially adding utility to your staff attacks. Unlike the warrior and the rogue, the Mage can look and play very different depending on what skills you spec into. As I said before, you can lean into practically every school of magic at all times, and what that gives you is an incredibly flexible class. Not only do you have 2 different weapon sets, but you can enhance them further via the skill tree depending on what fits your style the best. What the Mage brings to the table is a true fluidity during combat, and because your light, heavy, channeled, and charged attacks can all be used with both weapons at any time, you don't have the combat disconnect you have on a class like the Rogue, which uses 2 distinctly independent weapons. If you're building the Mage properly, balancing builder and spender abilities, what you'll come to find is that the Mage rarely has any downtime, which I personally love. Of course, you'll have to use your primary attacks, but because of the interaction with arcane orbs, there's a fun subsystem that keeps the combat interesting in those small gaps when abilities or companion skills are on cooldown. Where the magic, no pun intended, really happens is in the moments where you're stringing together spell after spell, freezing, burning, electrifying, and then eventually obliterating your enemies. It's a swirl of particle effects and insane damage numbers, and when everything lines up, it's one of the most satisfying class experiences in all of Veilguard. So there you have it, the 3 Dragon Age the Veilguard classes and everything you need to know about them before jumping into the action and making your choice. If you have any lingering questions, leave us a comment down below, and if you want more Dragon Age Veilguard in your feeds, do me a solid, hit that thumbs up, and consider subscribing because we have a lot more coming your way. Thanks again to EA for sponsoring this video, and as always, my name is Cody Akin from everyone here at Legacy Gaming. Thanks for watching, and play on.